The prairie stretched endless and raw, where dust carried on the wind and the sun painted everything in harsh, unflinching light. A solitary farm lay on the outskirts of Red Bluff, a cluster of tilled fields stubbornly clinging to life in the dry soil, a weather-beaten cabin with its porch sagging like tired shoulders, and a windmill that creaked with every turn as though it carried the weight of the world. Crows circled overhead, black flecks against the wide western sky, their cries sharp and distant. This land belonged to a man few really knew. His name was Eli Mercer, a farmer with a quiet presence and a habit of keeping his eyes lowered, as if he could disappear into the earth if he just stayed still long enough. Eli lived alone, working sunup to sundown without complaint. His hands were hard and scarred, the kind that looked carved from stone, yet when he moved, he carried himself with a restraint that seemed out of place among men accustomed to spit and brawl their way through life. To the townsfolk, he was a man without story, just another drifter who had laid down roots where no one else dared. Mothers whispered he was odd, too quiet, too watchful. Men at the saloon dismissed him as weak, someone who wouldn't so much as raise his voice if a man spat on his boots. That suited Eli fine. He never argued, never joined the laughter, never sought trouble. Trouble, though, had a way of finding men who didn't ask for it. It came in the form of 6 riders cresting the ridge one hot afternoon. Dust billowed around their horses, long shadows cutting across the parched ground. They rode with the easy arrogance of men who had never been told no, their spurs jingling, rifles slung loose across their saddles, laughter loud enough to scatter the crows. The gang was known in whispers from here to Abilene, Harlan Pike's lot, men who made their living by stripping others of theirs. They came down the slope like wolves closing on a lamb, circling Eli's fields, whooping as they rode between furrows of young corn, trampling what had taken months of backbreaking work to coax from the soil. Eli was by the barn when they arrived, pitchfork in hand, shirt damp with sweat. He straightened slowly as Harlan himself pulled his horse to a stop, the animal pawing at the earth. Harlan's grin was wide, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. He looked Eli up and down as if measuring the worth of a man in one glance. "Well now," Harlan drawled, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, "if it ain't the ghost of Red Bluff himself. Quiet little farmer, tending his garden like some old woman. Ain't that something, boys?" The others laughed, jeering, their voices carrying on the dry wind. Eli said nothing, only watched them with a calmness that unsettled some of the younger riders. But Harlan was undeterred. He leaned forward at his saddle, pointing a gloved hand toward the small herd of cattle penned near the barn. "Reckon you got yourself more beef than a mun like you needs. A men like me, though, we put it to good use. What'd you say you let us take 1 or 2? Call it neighborly charity." Eli's gaze flicked toward the herd, then back to Harlan. His lips parted, but no words came. He simply lowered his eyes and set the pitchfork aside. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "See that, boys?" Harlan laughed, a sound sharp as broken glass. Not a lick of fight in him. Farmer knows his place. One of the outlaws dismounted, swaggering over to the pen. He unlatched the gate, driving 2 cows out into the open, slapping their rumps as they stumbled toward the gang's horses. The men hollered and cheered as though it were sport. Eli stood still, arms loose at his sides, his face unreadable. His quiet unnerved them more than a shout might have, but Harlan brushed it off. He spat again, eyes narrowing. "You got good land here, Mercer. Better than most. Seems a shame woman hogs it all. Maybe next time we come by, we'll take a bit more off your hands." The gang wheeled their horses, dust clouding the air as they drove the stolen cattle ahead. Their laughter echoed long after they disappeared over the ridge. Eli stood alone in the silence that followed, the windmill creaking mournfully above him. He turned back to his fields, gaze lingering on the trampled corn, the churned-up earth where the cattle had been. He bent, picked up the pitchfork again, and went back to work without a word. Word spread fast in Red Bluff. By evening, the saloon buzzed with talk of the quiet farmer humiliated on his own land. Some pitied him, saying no man could stand against Pike's gang. Others sneered, claiming Eli had no backbone, that he'd rather lose his cattle than lift a hand in defense. At a corner table, the old sheriff nursed a glass of whiskey, eyes narrowed as he listened. He'd seen men like Eli before, men who stayed silent because they had too much rattling in their past to let loose again. He didn't speak of it, though. Folks liked their gossip simple, not tangled with truths they couldn't stomach. By the next week, the gang returned. This time they didn't bother with cattle. They rode straight through Eli's wheat, flattening stalks under pounding hooves, laughed aloud enough to wake the dead. They shouted insults, mocking his silence. One of them tossed a dead rabbit onto his porch, a sick kind of gift. "For your supper, farmer," the men hollered before riding off, laughter trailing behind him. Eli watched from the doorway, jaws set tight, but said nothing. The rabbit lay there in the dust until the sun baked it stiff. Children whispered when he passed in town. "That's him," they said, "the farmer who won't fight." Women clucked their tongues. Men shook their heads. "He's as good as finished," one rancher said at the feed store. "A men who won't stand up don't last long in this country." Eli didn't argue. He bought his supplies, tipped his hat, and walked home with the same slow, deliberate steps he always took. The whispers clung to him like burrs, but he shed them with silence. Harlan Pike enjoyed the game too much to quit. Each visit grew bolder. They stole chickens, smashed fence posts, cut his water line. They laughed harder when Eli didn't lift a hand. To them, he was a toy, a way to prove their power without risk. To the town, he was a man stripped of pride. And yet, when anyone looked close, there was something in his eyes, a stillness, a patience, like a river held back by a dam. Nobody noticed it long enough to wonder what might happen if the dam ever broke. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and the fields lay in ruin, Harlan stood in Eli's yard with his men. He leaned forward in the saddle, voice dripping with mockery. "Farmer, I reckon we'll come back round in a week. Maybe we'll take your barn next, or maybe the roof off your house. Depends on what kind of mood we're in. You think on that while you hoe your little rows of dirt." The men roared with laughter, the sound fading as they rode into the dusk. Eli remained still long after they vanished, the last light glinting off his weathered face. The creak of the windmill carried across the land, steady and relentless. His fields were broken, his herd thinned, his home mocked. But his silence was not surrender. It was something else, something no one in Red Bluff yet understood. And though the outlaws believed him powerless, their words had struck deep, steering shadows that had long lain quiet. The prairie night closed around him, the wind whispering through the grass like a secret waiting to be told, and in the distance coyotes howled as if warning of what was yet to come. The gossip spread like wildfire through Red Bluff, carried on hushed voices and careless laughs. In the mercantile, women leaned over barrels of flour to murmur that Eli Mercer had let Pike's men walk all over him. In the saloon, ranch hands shook their heads between swallows of whiskey, declaring him a coward unfit to own a piece of land in the West. Some men pitied him, saying no one could stand against Harlan Pike and his riders, not without getting themselves killed. Others sneered, insisting a real man would rather die on his feet than live bowed to outlaws. Eli's silence became the town's favorite subject, a mirror for their own fears, their own bravado, their own desperate need to believe that they wouldn't have done the same. On the far side of town, a widow named Clara Densmore tended her garden with stiff hands as she listened to the talk. She remembered a winter evening years ago, before Eli Mercer had built his cabin, when a stranger rode through with the kind of eyes that made men sit straighter. She hadn't thought of that stranger in years, but when she saw Eli's face now, lined, weathered, but still carrying a quiet gravity, something clicked uneasily in her mind. He carried himself differently from the farmer she had known, his shoulders squared as though always expecting the weight of trouble. "That man wasn't born to turn the soil," she told her sister one night. "He carries old things inside him, things he don't speak of." Sheriff Amos Doolin, old and half-crippled from a bullet lodged in his hip, listened from the corner of the saloon as men joked about Eli. He remembered another name from his younger days, a name that once rode whispered through the territories like a storm cloud, Mercer. Back then, men swore a gunman by that name had put more outlaws in the ground than half the sheriffs combined. The memory tugged at him when he saw Eli's hands. They were not just rough from farming, they were scarred, the kind of scars men carried from steel biting skin, not plow handles. And then there was the way Eli's eyes moved when he walked through town. He didn't glance like a man distracted. He scanned like a soldier, noting every doorway, every hand near a belt buckle. Amos said nothing, but the thought stuck with him like a burr under a saddle. The outlaws, meanwhile, weren't finished with their game. They came riding again, dust rising around them like smoke, their laughter cutting across the fields. This time they found young David McGraw, Eli's farmhand, hauling water from the creek. David was barely 17, all elbows and eagerness, the kind of boy who still believed strength was proved by the loudness of his voice. When Pike's men cornered him, demanding he hand over the buckets, David squared his shoulders and spat in the dirt. "Ain't yours," he said, his voice cracking. The riders laughed. One of them, lean and mean with yellow teeth, swung down from his horse and knocked the boy flat with a single punch. They kicked him in the ribs until he lay groaning in the dust. Then they dumped the buckets, spilling water back into the dry earth, before riding off howling like coyotes. Eli found David there, curled on his side, gasping for air. He lifted the boy gently, carried him to the cabin, and laid him on the cot. David, eyes glassy with pain, whispered, "Why don't you stop them?" "You could have," but Eli only laid a damp cloth on his bruised face and said nothing. He moved with calm purpose, tending the boy's wounds with the care of a father, though his own jaw worked tight as if he chewed on words he'd never speak. David wanted anger, wanted fire, but he got only the silence of a man holding something back. Days later, Pike's gang struck harder. They came at dawn, circling the corral with hoots and gunfire. Chickens scattered, feathers swirling in the air, and one of the outlaws shot a cow dead just to hear it fall. The others cheered as blood soaked into the dirt. Eli stood in the yard, still as a stone, watching his livelihood bleed out. He didn't shout. He didn't fire back. He just waited until the riders grew bored and thundered away, leaving ruin behind them. When it was quiet again, he moved slowly, closed the cow's staring eyes, and began to dig a grave in the far corner of the field. His shovel bit the earth over and over, steady and patient, the sound carrying across the land like a heartbeat. Neighbors who came to watch whispered that the man had no pride left. Some even turned away in disgust. "He's dead inside already," one muttered. "Might as well let Pike finish him." But Clara Densmore, watching from the road, saw something different in the way his shoulders flexed, the rhythm of his work. "That ain't surrender," she whispered to herself. "That's waiting." Sheriff Amos, too, caught a glimpse of Eli pausing at dusk, leaning against his fence. The man's face was calm, but his eyes, they were measuring distance, wind, light, the way a marksman does without even thinking. Amos felt a chill crawl up his spine. He wondered if Pike knew what kind of fire he was stoking. The outlaws didn't notice. They saw only what they wanted to see, a man too broken to fight. Their cruelty sharpened, born of boredom and arrogance, until even townsfolk grew restless with the sight. "If he won't stand up," one rancher spat, "maybe we ought to drive him out ourselves. A man like that makes us all look weak." Yet even as they mocked him, there was unease in their laughter. For no matter how much they tried to define him, Eli Mercer remained something they couldn't quite pin down. He endured with the stillness of a mountain, and mountains, folks knew, held storms inside them. One night, after the gang had ridden off leaving smashed barrels and a burned wagon behind, Eli sat alone on his porch. The prairie stretched black around him, stars scattered across the heavens. He lit a lantern, its glow throwing shadows across his face. His hands rested on his knees, scarred, strong hands, the kind that remembered more than they showed. His eyes swept the land with that same restless precision, noting every rustle, every flicker of movement. There was a weight in him, something coiled tight, like a rifle cocked and waiting. He drew a long breath, let it out slow, and closed his eyes. By midsummer the gang no longer bothered with shadows. Harlan Pike and his riders came thundering down Red Bluff's main street in broad daylight, spurs clattering, revolvers flashing in the sun. They rode past the sheriff's office with jeers, tossing empty bottles against the walls just to hear the glass shatter. The sheriff, old Amos Doolin, watched from behind his desk, hand hovering near the pistol on his hip but never drawing it. His badge had no weight against half a dozen rifles and a leader who laughed at law. Folks lined the boardwalks, faces tight with fear, pretending to busy themselves while the gang cut through town like wolves circling a pen. They grew bolder with each visit. They stole liquor from the saloon, overturned wagons in the street, and once tied a man's mule to the hitching post upside down just to hear the poor beast bray. The town endured it the way a body endures a fever, praying it might burn itself out before it killed them. Some looked to Eli Mercer as though hoping his silence might sprout into defiance, but he gave them nothing. He worked his rows, carried his goods to market, and never once raised his voice against the storm gathering around him. One hot afternoon, the market square was alive with the noise of barter and trade, women selling preserves, ranchers haggling over seed, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer ringing steady in the background. Eli stood at a stall weighing out beans, his shoulders bowed slightly under the sun. He felt the tension in the air before the sound reached him, the unmistakable whoop of riders. Heads turned. Dust kicked up at the edge of the street, and Harlan Pike's gang came swaggering into the square as though they owned it. Their laughter split the crowd, scattering mothers and children, leaving only the curious and the foolish to linger. "Looky here," one outlaw called, spotting Eli. He was a lean man with a scar down his jaw and eyes that glittered mean in the light. "Our quiet farmer come to buy himself supper. Wonder what a coward eats these days." The men laughed, cruel and hollow. Eli said nothing, just picked up his sack of beans and started toward the street. The outlaw stepped in his path, hand hovering near his revolver. "What's the matter? Don't like my company?" He shoved Eli's chest hard enough to stagger him back a step. Eli steadied himself, his sack slipping but not falling, his eyes meeting the outlaw's with a calm that cut deeper than any insult. The crowd thickened, whispers flying like sparks. Someone muttered, "He ought to hit him back." Another said, "Man's made of ice. Don't even bleed." The outlaw grinned, eager to show the town he could break the unbreakable. He pulled his revolver, leveling it at Eli's chest. Gasps rippled through the market. Women pulled their children close. Even the sheriff, leaning on his cane from across the square, froze with his hand half-drawn. Eli did not move. He stood in the street, the barrel of death inches from his heart, and his eyes stayed steady as a stone. Not a tremor, not a flinch. That stillness unsettled the outlaw more than any drawn gun might have. His smirk faltered, his grip tightening as if he could force fear out of the moon before him. But Eli only looked back, calm as the horizon. Harlan laughed from his saddle, amused. "Put it away, Doyle. Man's not worth the powder. Look at him, too dead already to bother." The outlaw sneered, shoved his revolver back in its holster, and spat at Eli's boots. "Next time, farmer, maybe I won't miss." With that, the gang scattered through the square, overturning barrels, snatching apples off stalls, raising chaos before riding out again. The market slowly returned to motion, but the silence hung heavy. People stole glances at Eli, some with pity, others with a strange kind of unease. One man whispered, "Maybe he's a coward." Another, shaking his head, muttered, "Or maybe he's waiting for something. God help us if he is." That night, Eli sat alone on his porch, the lantern light flickering against his face. He thought of the revolver pressed close, the weight of its shadow like an old, familiar hand. Memory stirred, sharp and unwelcome, the crack of gunfire in canyon echoes, the hot rush of blood, the faces of men falling, one after another. He remembered the way his name had once carried through the West like a curse, how children were hushed with warnings that Mercer would come if they disobeyed. He had walked away from it all when the killing had piled too high, when he could no longer stand the smell of powder and the silence that followed each shot. Farming had been his salvation, a way to bury the gun beneath the soil and let seeds grow where men had once fallen. But trouble never stayed buried long on this frontier. He rubbed the scars on his hands, the deep lines that plow handles could not explain. They were reminders of nights when he slept with a pistol under his cheek, of duels at dawn when the world held its breath and waited for thunder. He had promised himself he would never go back. The earth was his refuge, not the iron. And yet, as he sat listening to the windmill groan against the night air, he knew the world was pressing him closer to the edge he had tried so long to leave behind. In town, whispers shifted with the wind. Some called him a coward, their contempt sharp and easy. Others, though, weren't so sure. They spoke of the way he hadn't blinked with a gun in his face, the way his eyes had stared straight through the outlaw as if measuring something unseen. "A man doesn't stand that still unless he's faced it before," they said. Some wondered aloud if Eli Mercer had been someone else once, someone the West had forgotten. The sheriff, nursing his whiskey, muttered into the glass, "Forgotten, maybe, but not gone." The gang, tasting his silence like blood in the water, grew drunk on their own power. Harlan Pike wanted more than laughter. He wanted to break the moon completely. On their next visit, they didn't bother with small torments. They rode through town with rifles held high, their voices booming like thunder. Harlan reined up in front of the mercantile, dust rolling off his horse's hooves, and declared for all to hear, "1 week from tonight, we're gonna ride out to Mercer's land and burn it clean to the ground. Burn the barn, burn the fields, burn the house that keeps him hid. Maybe then he'll find his tongue, or maybe we'll just leave him in the ashes." Gasps broke from the crowd. No one moved, no one spoke. The gang laughed as though they had already struck the match, their voices echoing through the wide street before they wheeled their horses and rode out, dust swallowing them whole. In the silence they left behind, the townsfolk turned uneasy eyes toward the edge of town, where a lonely farm stood against the horizon. Eli Mercer walked away from the square without a word, but the weight of what was coming pressed heavy on every heart that watched him go. The night they came was dry and still, the kind of night where the air itself seemed brittle enough to shatter. Eli had been mending a fence post when the faint rumble of hooves reached him from across the plain. He set the hammer down, straightened, and listened. The sound grew louder, multiplied, until it became a rolling storm breaking against the silence. Then the glow appeared on the horizon, a flicker at first, then a hungry blaze stretching higher with each passing second. By the time Harlan Pike and his riders swept onto the farm, torches blazing in their hands, Eli already knew what they meant to do. The gang circled the barn first, whooping and hollering as though it were a festival. Torches arced through the night, striking dry timber with a hiss. In moments the barn caught, flames racing up its sides like wolves up a hill, smoke curling black into the star-scattered sky. Horses screamed inside, kicking at their stalls, until one outlaw swung the doors open and drove them shrieking into the dark. The men laughed, slapping each other's backs, faces lit orange by firelight. The barn roof groaned, timber snapping as sparks flew into the fields. Eli stood by the porch, motionless, his face bathed in the glow of destruction. His livelihood, stacked high with hay and tools, years of sweat embedded in those walls, crumbled in minutes. His eyes did not move from the fire, though his jaw clenched tight, the muscles in his neck rigid as stone. To the gang it looked like surrender, the farmer too broken to even shout. To anyone watching closer, it was something else entirely, a stillness that carried weight like the silence before thunder. The townsfolk had gathered along the road, drawn by the blaze. Mothers clutched children to their skirts, men shifted uneasily, the light of the fire reflected in their fearful eyes. Some shouted to Eli, begging him to run. "Leave it, Mercer," one cried. "They'll kill you if you stay." Others hurled words sharper than knives. "You're a fool," a rancher spat. "Too weak to fight, too stubborn to flee. You'll roast in your own ashes before you raise a hand." Their voices blended with the crackle of fire, a chorus of pity and scorn that rolled uselessly across the flames. The outlaws fed on the moment, drunk with power. One hurled a torch onto the wagon, another into a stack of wood by the shed. Flames leapt higher, sparks catching in the wheat. The night roared alive with destruction, the land itself seeming to cry out as everything Eli had built turned to cinders. Harlan Pike reined in his horse near the porch, leaning forward with a sneer carved deep into his face. "You see this, farmer? This is what silence buys you. All the land, all the sweat, gone like smoke. Next time, it'll be your house. Next time, it'll be you." Eli's gaze finally moved, lifting to meet Pike's. For a heartbeat the outlaw faltered, something in those eyes unnerving him, a depth that spoke of places he'd never dared ride. But then he barked a laugh, spat into the dirt, and wheeled his horse, calling to his men. They thundered off into the darkness, their laughter trailing behind them like hyenas into the night. The fire raged long after the sound of hooves had vanished, throwing shadows across the land like demons dancing. When the last torch burned itself to ash, the crowd thinned, muttering. Some shook their heads, convinced Eli Mercer had lost everything. Others pitied him but kept their distance, as though his silence might infect them if they lingered. Soon only the crackle of smoldering wood and the creak of the windmill remained. Eli stood alone before the ruin, smoke curling around him, sparks stinging his skin. He breathed deep, as if inhaling the ashes of his old life, then turned and stepped into the house. Inside, the cabin was dark but for the faint glow seeping through the windows. The floorboards groaned under his boots as he crossed the room. He paused by the table, fingers tracing the wood worn smooth by years of quiet suppers, and then knelt near the hearth. With deliberate hands he pried up a loose plank, the nails shrieking softly as though in protest. Beneath the floorboards lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, edges stained with time. He lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and carried it into the lanterlight. The cloth peeled away to reveal steel that gleamed even in the dim glow. It wasn't just any rifle. The barrel was long, hand-forged with etchings faint but visible, the stock polished to a sheen that spoke of pride and mastery. It was a weapon built for precision, a marksman's tool, the kind of gunmen whispered about around campfires. His hands closed around it with the ease of old memory, his fingers fitting grooves worn by years long past. Scars on his palms aligned perfectly with the wood, as though the rifle had grown with him, a piece of himself buried but never lost. Eli sat with the rifle across his knees, the weight of it pulling him backward through time. He remembered nights in canyons where moonlight lit the barrel before the crack split silence. He remembered duels on dusty streets where men had thought themselves fast, only to fall before they drew. He remembered the fear in others' eyes when they realized they faced Mercer, the Deadshot, a name carried like a curse across the frontier. He had buried that name the day he laid down his gun, swearing he'd never again let the weight of death ride his shoulders. But the fire outside told him the past was not done with him yet. He ran a cloth across the steel, cleaning away dust, each stroke steady and practiced. The house was silent save for the faint hiss of embers outside, the world holding its breath as Eli worked. He checked the chamber, the sight, the trigger, movements done with such familiarity that no thought was needed. The rifle was not just a weapon, it was a truth long denied, a truth the West had tried to forget. And now it had been called back into the light. When he finished, he set the rifle across the table, his gaze lingering on it. His eyes were no longer those of a farmer but of a moon awakening from a long sleep, the steel of his spirit rising with the weapon in his hands. Outside, the wind carried the smell of smoke and ruin, the ashes of everything he had tried to build. Eli Mercer sat in the glow of the lantern, scars lit like old maps across his skin, and in his silence lay a promise that the West would soon remember the name it had buried. Would you like me to push straight into Section 5, where Eli finally shows his hand against the gang, or pause here so you can give me refinements before I continue? The moon rose swollen and pale, its light spilling silver across the fields where ash still smoldered from the ruin left behind. The prairie was quiet except for the sigh of wind through blackened timber, the lonely creak of the windmill turning as it always had. Eli Mercer stood in that silence, his rifle in hand, the stock resting against his shoulder as naturally as if it had never left. He had spent the day cleaning, preparing, steadying himself. Now, as night settled heavy over Red Bluff, he waited. They came just as he knew they would, the thunder of hooves rolling across the dark like distant storm clouds. 6 shadows crested the ridge, torches bobbing in their fists, laughter sharp and careless. To them, it was a game. They had broken barns, beaten boys, spilled blood without consequence. Tonight, they came expecting to see what was left of a farmer's will crumble to dust. Instead, the night itself seemed to hold its breath as the gang drew near. Harlan Pike rode at the front, his black hat low, torchlight cutting across his grin. "Ready for round 2, farmer," he called, voice carrying across the yard. His men hooped, their horses scattering sparks from stone as they reined in near the charred skeleton of the barn. But there was no answer, no frightened men stumbling from the shadows. Only the quiet figure standing still beneath the porch, a rifle gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The torchlight flickered across Eli's face, and for the first time, the gang saw something they hadn't noticed before. Not fear. Not even anger. Just calm. The first shot split the night with a crack that shook the air. One of the riders jerked back in the saddle, torch tumbling from his hand, eyes wide as he crumpled before he could even scream. The echo rolled across the plains, swallowed by silence, and in that silence came the second shot. Another outlaw toppled backward, boots slipping from stirrups as his horse bolted wild into the dark. Panic rippled through the gang, their laughter dying on their lips, replaced by curses shouted into the night. Harlan shouted for them to spread, to fire back, but every time one raised his revolver, another thunderclap split the air. Eli moved with impossible precision, each breath measured, each pull of the trigger as deliberate as the tick of a clock. He didn't rush. He didn't waste. The rifle spoke with deadly authority, and every time it spoke, a man fell. The flames from the dropped torches danced across the dirt, casting the riders in wild light as they scattered, firing blindly into shadows that never missed them back. Horses screamed, bullets sang into nothing, and still Eli stood unshaken, his silhouette against the cabin as steady as stone. From the ridge above, townsfolk watched in stunned silence. They had come to witness ruin, some driven by morbid curiosity, others by guilt for having stood idle too long. Now they pressed against each other, mouths open, eyes wide, as they saw the quiet farmer move with the grace of a man who had done this 100 times before. Gasps tore through the crowd with each shot, each outlaw dropping as though struck down by the hand of fate itself. Mothers clutched children tighter, men who had once mocked him whispered in awe. The legend was being carved into the night before their eyes. But for Eli, it was not vengeance that steadied his hand. It was memory. Each shot carried with it the weight of faces long gone, the echoes of a life he had sworn never to live again. He wasn't fighting to avenge a burned barn or stolen cattle. He fought because he knew what it meant when men like Pike were allowed to roam free, carving terror into every town they touched. He fought because silence had cost him before, and he would not let Red Bluff bleed as he once had. His finger curled, the rifle cracked, and the balance tipped further with every thunderous echo. Soon only 2 remained. One rider wheeled frantically, spurring his horse toward the dark horizon, shouting that the devil himself lived in Mercer's skin. Eli let him go. Fear would spread faster than any bullet, and the tale of this night would ride with him across the territory. That left Harlan Pike, still astride his black horse, torchlight dancing across the hard lines of his face. He had seen his men fall one after another, their bodies littering the field, smoke curling around them. Still, he sat tall in the saddle, though his eyes betrayed the tremor of a man staring into the abyss. He drew his revolver with a jerk, fired wild into the dark, the shot harmless against the night. Eli didn't move. He let the outlaw hear his own ragged breath, let the silence press in on him like a hand around the throat. Then he stepped forward into the torchlight, rifle gleaming, his eyes cold as winter stone. The crowd on the ridge held their breath. The night itself seemed to hang on the space between them. Harlan's voice broke against the quiet. "What are you?" he shouted, his bravado fraying at the edges. "You're no farmer." His hand shook on the revolver, sweat glistening on his face despite the cool night air. Eli's voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying more weight than the rifle itself. "I'm a man who's buried enough to know what it costs. But you brought this here. You chose it." Harlan's horse shifted nervously, ears pinned back as though it too felt the weight of those words. The outlaw swallowed, rage and fear warring in his eyes. "You can't kill me, Mercer. You kill me and you're just the same as you always were. Just another butcher." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fear he tried to hide. Eli leveled the rifle, the stock pressing firm against his shoulder, his cheek settling against it like an old friend. His finger brushed the trigger, but his eyes never left Pike's. For a long moment, the world stood still, moonlight, smoke, fear, and silence all bound together in a single heartbeat. And then Eli lowered the rifle. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every man, woman, and child on the ridge heard it clear. "I don't need to kill you, Harlan. You'll do that yourself. The world has a way of taking care of men like you." He turned his back, rifle at his side, and walked slowly toward the cabin, leaving Pike trembling in the saddle, surrounded by the ruin of his men. The outlaw's scream of rage carried into the night, echoing across the plains, but no shot followed. He knew what Eli had spared him from, and it was worse than death, a life where every shadow might hide the men who had broken him. The crowd on the ridge stirred, whispers swelling into awe. The farmer they had pitied, scorned, dismissed as weak, had stood against the storm and revealed himself for what he truly was, the deadliest shot in the West. And yet, as he vanished into the shadows of his cabin, rifle still gleaming in the moonlight, there was no triumph in his stride. Only the weary weight of a man who carried justice not as a crown but as a curse, ensuring no one else would suffer as he once had. The night had grown still again, the echoes of gunfire fading into the vastness of the plains. Smoke from smoldering timbers curled into the sky, twisting in the pale light of the moon. Bodies lay scattered where they had fallen, horses wandering riderless into the dark. Harlan Pike remained, gripping the reins of his black horse with white-knuckled fists, his chest heaving, eyes wide as though staring into something more terrible than death. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the creak of leather and the faint crackle of embers. Across the yard, Eli Mercer stood with his rifle lowered, his gaze steady and unflinching, the embodiment of the calm that had preceded the storm. Harlan forced his voice through his dry throat, sharp and desperate. "What are you?" he demanded, though the tremor in his tone betrayed the fear beneath. He slid down from his saddle, boots striking the dirt with an unsteady thud. His hand gripped his revolver, though he didn't lift it. He stared at Eli as though the farmer had peeled away his skin and revealed something monstrous beneath. "You're no plowman. No dirt grubber. Who the hell are you, Mercer?" Eli's eyes flicked over the moon before him, the quiver in his stance, the arrogance slipping like sand through fingers. His voice came low, even, each word carrying the weight of long-buried truth. "I was a man once feared. A name that made towns shutter their doors, made men cross the street rather than look me in the eye. I lived by the gun, and the gun took everything I loved in return." He glanced briefly toward the smoking ruin of his barn, the ashes drifting like snowflakes on the wind. "So I put it down. Swore I'd never raise it again. Thought I could bury it under the soil. Thought I could grow something worth saving." Harlan barked a laugh, harsh and hollow, though his eyes darted like a trapped animal's. "You, a legend." He shook his head, as if denial could shield him. Just a broken farmer pretending at silence. Yet even as he spoke, his hand trembled against the revolver at his hip, and the truth etched itself deeper in the lines of his face. He had seen the shots that night, too precise, too cold, too final. He knew no farmer could move with that kind of certainty. Eli lifted the rifle again, not rushing, simply letting the barrel find its line. He sighted the outlaw with calm precision, the movement so fluid it seemed less an act of choice than a simple inevitability. The crowd that had gathered on the ridge watched in silence, hearts pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm about to break. Harlan's lips parted, a flicker of panic in his eyes as he realized the balance of his life hung in the steady grip of a mun he had mocked as powerless. "I didn't want this fight," Eli said, his voice cutting through the night air. "But you brought it here." His finger rested against the trigger, the rifle's weight familiar against his shoulder. Harlan staggered back a step, revolver half-drawn, though his courage faltered as he stared down the barrel that had already claimed his men. His arrogance wavered, replaced by the raw desperation of a mun standing face-to-face with justice long delayed. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The wind stilled, the embers hissed, and the crowd above forgot to breathe. Then Eli lowered the rifle, letting it hang loose at his side. His eyes, cold yet strangely merciful, never left Harlan's. "You'll die by the same road you've ridden your whole life," he said, voice carrying with the weight of prophecy. "But it won't be by my hand tonight." Harlan trembled, caught between rage and relief, his chest heaving. He raised the revolver an inch as though to test fate, but when Eli didn't flinch, the weapon sagged uselessly in his grip. His voice cracked, a whisper of disbelief. "You should have finished me." He stumbled back, climbed onto his horse with clumsy movements, and kicked it hard into the night. The black shape vanished into the horizon, leaving only the hollow echo of hooves fading into nothing. The dawn came slow, washing the plains in pale gold. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from the ashes of the barn, curling against the sky. The town stood hushed, gathered still on the ridge, their faces etched with awe and fear. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, a truth they would carry back into every saloon, every parlor, every dusty road from here to the border. Eli Mercer, the quiet farmer, had shown himself as more than a mun. He was a legend reborn. Eli lowered himself onto the porch steps, the rifle across his knees, his gaze on the horizon. He felt no triumph, no victory, only the weary weight of a mun who had broken his own vow, who had let the gun speak again after years of silence. He knew what stories would follow, how his name would once more drift like smoke across the west. But he also knew the cost. For every man who whispered his legend, there would be another who came seeking to test it. The peace he had sought would never return. Still, he could not regret it. Better that his farm burn, better that his hands bear the weight, than that Red Bluff or any other town suffer as he once had. The people of Red Bluff drifted away with the dawn, their whispers trailing behind them. Some spoke of fear, others of gratitude, all of them bound by the truth that the mun they had pitted had stood against the fire and turned it back. Children would grow up hearing the tale, mothers would hush them with his name, men would carry it with them like a warning carved into the bones of the land. Eli rose with the sun, rifle in hand, and walked across the yard. His boots crunched in the ash, the wind carrying smoke into the pale morning light. He paused once, looking back at the ruin of his barn, then continued on, his stride steady, his figure fading into the horizon. He carried no banner, no pride, only the silence of a mun who had done what had to be done. And so the legend was born. Not of a lawman, nor of an outlaw, but of a quiet farmer who had once laid down his gun, only to raise it again when justice left him no choice. His name might fade with time, blurred by retelling, twisted by distance, but the story would endure. Across canyons and deserts, across saloons and campfires, they would speak of him, the farmer who was the deadliest shot in the West, the men who stood alone when the fire came. And long after Eli Mercer's footsteps vanished into dust, the legend of the quiet farmer would remain, echoing against the wide and endless sky.